What are variables? So just as a little vocabulary review, the x-axis is the horizontal axis, and the y-axis is the vertical axis. And as we're talking about real graphs, we sort of refer to them as x and y a little less. So I just wanted to review that information. So the y-axis is vertical, which is the up and down axis, and the x-axis is horizontal, which is the one that goes across. Variables are the values that are measured on the axes of the graph. So in this graph on the left, the variable on the y-axis is distance, and the variable on the x-axis is the time taken, or just time. In the graph on the right, we see that the variable on the y-axis is plant height after 2 weeks, and the variable on the x-axis is the amount of fertilizer that a plant has been given. The x-axis is called the independent variable, while the y-axis is called the dependent variable. The reason for this is that the y variable depends on the x variable. The y variable depends on x. And that's the way for all graphs, or the way that graphs should be. That's the correct way to graph variables. So for example here, the moose population is given as time. The population of moose is dependent. The y variable is dependent. I'm going to spell that a little better. Dependent. Well, the x variable is independent. And it helps to talk about the relation of those two variables. The moose population depends on what year it is. But try reversing that and think about how weird that would be. The year does not depend on the number of moose that are in Newfoundland. That would be a really weird way to determine what year it is. But the moose population does depend on what year it is. If it's 1990, the population will be different than if it's 2015. Here's another really good example of this. So first, let's identify the dependent and independent variables. So I'll write D for dependent. So the dependent variable is on the y-axis. So in this case, that would be the plant height. And the independent variable is the one on the x-axis. That would be the amount of fertilizer. So what we're being told here is that the plant height depends on the amount of fertilizer that the plant is given. And that makes a lot of sense. If a plant receives very little fertilizer, it'll probably grow, but not as high. And if a plant is given quite a bit of fertilizer, it's probably going to grow much higher because it has more nutrients to grow with. So the plant height depends, that's why it's dependent, on the amount of fertilizer. We're also asked, what does the y-intercept represent? So the y-intercept we can find here, where the point where the graph meets the y-axis. And so the y-intercept is the height that a plant grows, in this case, without fertilizer, because it's where it receives 0 fertilizer. So Y-intercept is the height the plant grows without fertilizer.